Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Becoming Anchored podcast. My name is Laura Deneen. I'm one of your hosts. Lauren Jackson is not with us today, but she is with us in spirit. Welcome to this episode. So if you are new to the Becoming Anchored podcast, really the purpose of this podcast is twofold. So first and foremost, we are humans on this show with y'all. So y'all know this, that Lauren and I chat together sometimes, and then sometimes we get guests, but we really just want to show up authentically with our full selves. And then we have the amazing privilege of sitting with clients on a daily basis. And Lauren and I just truly love this work. It's such sacred work. It's such a gift to sit with our clients, and it feels like such a privilege. So we are here really just to ride the waves of life with y'all, and we're super thankful to have you today. And I am so excited for this episode. So real quick disclaimer before we dive right in, this is not therapy. If you are wanting therapy in the state of Tennessee, we would love to support you. If not, we encourage you to reach out to someone local to you. So without further ado, I am here to welcome Julianne and Poonam to this show today. So thank y'all for being
so much
here.
for having us here
honored.
today.
Yeah. So I actually follow these gals on Instagram and wanted to have them on the show for a few different reasons. So before I started Anchored, I did not have very much experience at all in business management or leadership. And so I have grown a lot just following your account on Instagram. And for the record, we'll highlight their offerings at the end of the show. But these ladies talk a lot about leadership and management. I know that they support a lot of therapists that own group practices or perhaps have employees. And so we really wanted to cover the topic of trauma-informed leadership and what that actually means. We certainly have values as a company, and one of them is practicing from a trauma-informed lens, right? And even on a deeper level, it's like, okay, well, what does that actually mean? And so I can't think of better people to join me for discussing this topic. So thank you again for being here. But this is a big one, right? Trauma-informed leadership. I'm like, okay, where do we start today? So yeah, I would love to hear from you all I think it's twofold, right? So what makes a practice trauma-informed in your opinions, and then how that pertains particularly to leadership?
Yeah. So I think that whenever we look at anything from a trauma-informed lens, first and foremost, what's most important to me is how do we honor the human across from us and their lived experiences? So within any practice, centering that value and then taking and carrying that into leadership. So we honor our patients and our clients by hearing their stories. And we do the same for our employees as leaders and honoring their lived experiences. So when we're leading equitably and leading in a way that really, again, honors any wisdom they're bringing in, any experiences they're bringing in, any identities they are sharing and holding, and then supporting them in being the best versions of themselves so that they can then best support our communities.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I hear in what you're saying, it's twofold, right? So it's both, I know that y'all work a lot with support of clients that are coming into the practice. Like, how do we best, first and foremost, serve our clients? And then how do we also serve people that might be employed by us? So because they're also taking care of the clients. And so it's twofold, that trauma-informed approach. We can't only be trauma-informed for our clients if our clinicians are taking care of the clients. So that totally makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah. Anything else that y'all can think of that makes, I love the equity that you're talking about, the honoring. I hear so much thoughtfulness in what you're sharing, and being mindful, I think, too, is a big piece of trauma-informed leadership, pausing to introspect. Anything else that y'all think makes a trauma-informed leader?
Yeah, I think, when we conceptualize for us as therapists first, like we're so aware of how important the relationship is when we're in the therapy room, right? And so I remember when I was a beginning therapist and that relief of being told like, okay, like, yes, you're wanting to get skills and techniques and really make sure you're showing up in service of the client. And at the end of the day, it's about the relationship. And so I think what we found in our leadership is it that kind of also overlays in the same process of like, yes, there's going to be leadership skills that you learn along the way. And yes, in leadership, you often are going to learn by the hard way because you kind of have to like live into the answer. You kind of feel like you're making things up and just want to normalize for anyone listening. Like that's totally normal. And I think in that process, as you're kind of like developing that skill, you can always kind of remind yourself that it's okay that I'm going to like have missteps or mistakes or be human in my leadership and have a group of people be witness to that, which is like so vulnerable. And at the end of the day, I can lean into the fact that I know I'm able to establish relationship and I can really focus in on that part and my strength in that and know that it's okay to like really spend time in that space.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're right. It is so vulnerable because I think even if we do years and years of therapy, vulnerability can still be quite difficult. And it's risky to be vulnerable because we don't know how that's going to be perceived. And some people might jive with it. Some people might not. Some people might have their own stories with authority and how that shows up in the context of them relating to you as the leader. And so there's all these moving, the way I like to think of it is like puzzle pieces that we are doing our best to like fit the puzzle pieces together for team cohesion. And there's going to be times when we mess up and we don't get it right. And I am the first to say that I have just learned so much about myself as a person, as a therapist, as a colleague. And then really it's challenged me in ways that I didn't know I needed to be challenged. And so I'm like, hi, it's me. I know as you're like normalizing this, like it's so normal. And I'm like, yes. And I had this dream to create a safe, loving, kind, supportive environment for therapists. And I actually didn't understand everything that entailed when I hired my first clinician. I guess it was almost 6 years ago now. And I'm certainly still learning. I'm the first to say like, yes, I still have a lot to learn. And those first 5 years of business ownership for me were trying. And the thing was I had done quite a bit of therapy, but all this to say, it's interesting because I tell clients this, like any new role we take on, it's an invitation to like introspect. And so that has been so true for me, whether we become like a mother or a partner or go through something hard. I really experienced that. And I don't know if that was maybe some overconfidence that I had because I had been in therapy for 7 years. And I was like, oh no, this is going to be a piece of cake. And it's not a piece of cake. Having employees and managing. And so I know I'm rambling a little bit, but all this to say is like, yes, the work that you all are doing is so important. As someone who I do feel like I learned a little bit through the fire, and I don't feel like I'm going through the fire anymore, but I do feel like that this first 5 years was a time of refinement.
Yeah, as a parallel, I would say Julianne and I both experienced similar in our leadership, and I think we end up, some of us end up in leadership or come into the space because we do want to create something warm and nurturing and inviting, whether this is something that we had and we want to pass on, or whether this is something we didn't have and actually want to create new or give differently. And the learning and the introspection is absolutely a punch in the gut because we're learning so much about ourselves and also having, we say we're putting hats on and we're wearing different hats. We're having an awareness of different things that perhaps we didn't have an awareness of before. So one of the things we talk about sometimes is like compassionate accountability. We want to be compassionate. We want to be empathic. We want to be there for our folks, and then realizing, oh, wait a minute, we actually have to talk about things like documentation and patient care and retention and things like that as part of this process so that our practices can thrive and so our teams can thrive. And so it's having to find that balance between those things that we value and hold so near to us in this creation, and then also balancing that with, well, how do we do this from a business standpoint and also keep our lights on? Those things exist. And so that was a lot of my learning anyway, is how do we do both? And how do we do it in a way that feels human-centered and values-aligned?
Gosh, yeah, we talk about a lot of these things in our practice with clients, right? So I think it's absolutely appropriate that we're talking about it with employees too. And this was an area of growth and is still, but I think one of the things, and I'd love to talk a little bit about this episode. I've done certainly some therapy around this, right? So I don't experience shame as I'm sharing this because I've been able to work through this. Now, maybe a few years ago, it was more of a shame response for me. But when I hired my first clinician and when I had an employee underneath me, so I'm a 3 on the Enneagram. I don't know if you all do the Enneagram, but I am an achiever. And a lot of this is from my own wounding. And I also really love dreaming and setting goals. I think it's temperamental as well. So yeah, I don't think there's inherently anything wrong with having goals. But the problem with my type of Enneagram and how that shows up in a workplace if it goes unchecked was that I made the mistake of telling clinicians to do a good job. And I made an assumption. So, circling back to what one of you first shared, right, about the assumption piece and really like honoring someone's story, I think that also makes us trauma informed, specifically as leaders, is resisting the urge to make assumptions that our staff understand what we're asking for. And so that was something that I really had to check myself on, because my version of a good job, right, might be different than someone else's version of a good job. And this, at the time, like just even developing policies and procedures and standard operating procedures where the expectations were very clear. Like, I am a trauma-informed therapist, but I didn't understand the need for that in leadership specifically. And I know that you all talk a lot about psychological safety, so I want to make sure we cover that in today's episode as well, like what that actually means. But that, I think, has created more safety and more overall wellness in the team, both from my end and their end, because they understand what I'm looking for. And I'm also not making assumptions that they know how to do the job that I'm expecting from them. So all that to say, that's just one area that I have like grown so much in, is the documentation and is this compassionate accountability. And yeah, it's when I think back to my younger self, I'm like, oh, I didn't know to do that. And now I do. And it can be easy as a leader to go into that shame response. I know I certainly have, of like, well, I should have done that from the beginning, or like, why didn't that cross my mind? But when we know more, we can do differently. And so that has been some of the work too for me, just as a trauma-informed leader, is like, am I outlining expectations clearly? Because if I'm not, then that's really on me, not on my staff. So anyway, that just came to mind as you all were sharing.
Yeah, definitely it takes a while to gain clarity around those pieces. I think so much of leadership is such a humbling process because of the way that we really do have to learn through the mistake piece, in the sense that different employees have different needs, and then the ethos of your group almost shifts depending on like the makeup of people and like what they're all like looking for or wanting. And so there's even like seasons that kind of come with that. And so you might kind of get down with one group what's needed and what's necessary, and then you have a change of staffing or whatever, and then all of a sudden that changes, right? So it's like we're always kind of changing. We're always, wearing the different hats and being asked to do so many things that are even outside of just therapists or just leader when we're in like business ownership, right? And so I think in that process, it's like, yeah, how do we be more gentle with ourselves? How do we be more compassionate with ourselves? Because I think when we see leaders thrive, it's the ones who can really offer themselves kindness and compassion, and also acknowledge the shame piece that comes up, the blame pieces that come up also, and to kind of hold space for both. Like, I can definitely be in my feelings and really feeling frustrated by so many things, or feeling like how unfair it can be that as a leader, you're always having to rise above. Like, that can feel really exhausting or tiring at times. And so knowing that you're always in that role, in that space, and trying to allow for that, and then also make sure you're showing up for your people so then they can do their best work. And so it's hard to have to be all these parts and kind of navigate and figure out what's really going to be values alignment for me. What does that mean when I have an employee who doesn't maybe share similar values, and or maybe they do, but they stack their values a little differently? How do we have conversation around that and name it, and still be able to create a culture where there at least is some clear shared values? So if we were really anchoring to what it's like to have those shared values, we then have shared language around how we're expected and encouraged or invited to really show up.
Yeah, absolutely. And even asking the question of what's most important to you, right? Yes. Are you driven by finances? Are you the sole provider for your family unit? Are you driven by autonomy? Are you driven by having a better work-life balance? And even just getting curious again, I think, about those helps us understand that each person is so unique and is driven differently. And we can honor, I think, them in that space. And yeah, speaking to the multiple hats, that was definitely a skill that I had to learn. And how do I like best take care of myself so that I can also show up well for my team? Because that was hard for me too, like switching from therapist to sitting with clients to having a team concern. And it felt like my nervous system, looking back even 4 or 5 years ago, it felt like too much for my nervous system. And, I know that we're all therapists here, so we understand what that means. But yeah, I mean, when we kind of shift gears here towards like the how-to, I would love to hear a little bit more about like, what y'all specifically think people could be doing differently as they introspect around their leadership. But that's one how-to, is like just tracking throughout the day what you're experiencing in your body. Like I told my husband, like, I feel like I'm having trouble like catching my breath. And that was a symptom to me that I was feeling dysregulated and something needed to change. And so, we have an office manager now, we have a clinical director, and that helps me be a better version of myself. But that didn't just happen overnight, right? So the wearing the many hats, we can either keep doing the same thing and expect different results, or we can like really take some like hard and fast inquiry and just really introspect around like what is and isn't working. So I love that.
And this is the how-to. It's the introspection. It's the awareness of the observation of what's happening in our bodies. Yeah. What are those feelings that are coming up? What are those thoughts that might be ruminating in our minds? And truly just being an observer of those things. Shame will come to visit us as well in those moments. Guilt might come to visit us in those moments. And how do we take those invitations and then choose to do something with it, which is really like our model. Our model talks about those different invitations that present themselves in leadership, and then we can move into action because now we're able to name that. So a great example is when resentment comes to visit. Resentment is a direct correlation to our clarity, transparency, and how honest and authentic we're being in our communication. So when resentment comes to visit, are we talking about boundaries? Are we talking about what our relational needs are? And how are we doing that in a way that feels good to everybody in the space, right? Or when shame comes to visit, do I need to practice some compassion towards myself? Do I need to just take care of myself and go get a drink of water because perhaps I've been not taking care of myself or neglecting my well-being for the sake of others, And so what are those invitations? What are those things that are coming up in our leadership? And now how do we proceed with that?
Yeah, I love that word, invitation. I've actually been using that more a little in my own practice because I think it lends itself to a posture of like curiosity over judgment. And in order, like y'all said, I mean, I know that y'all work with leaders all day, every day, most likely. And I think the leaders that have longevity in their careers, I agree with you, are the ones that are able to have compassion and have curiosity. And then we can learn and grow versus like staying so stuck in our shame, because shame can be so many things and can show up so differently for us. But I think that frozen response, or just like it can feel debilitating. So yeah, I love what y'all are sharing today. I'm curious. I think this is another how-to in a way, but I'm curious what helps a culture, whether that's a group of therapists, if you own a group practice and you're listening, or, maybe you work in a different type of business, and we're here for that too today. But I'm curious what helps create psychological safety. What comes to mind for y'all as we're like broaching this topic?
Yeah, we really conceptualize it like through the lens of our trust model. And so kind of what Poonam was starting to say is like when a leader starts to become aware of like the invitations and internally what's happening, it can start to help also shape what you're hoping to cultivate externally in your work culture. And so we have 5 elements in the way that we conceptualize what like a trauma-informed or psychological safety looks like in a work culture. And so just to go through it, we kind of define it as first, like, how are we being transparent in the way that we're showing up? How are we being clear on what needs and boundaries are? How are we being really collaborative in our process? How are we making sure we're on the same page? I think of all the times I've left meetings thinking I was like so clear. And then, and 2 days later, I realized that what everyone else heard was very different than what I thought I communicated, right? It's so normal. Even if we have good working relationships, those miscommunication things happen. And so we first like really focus in on like the transparency piece and then hand it off
so
to you.
repair is how we talk about being kind to ourselves. This is when shame shows up, when blame shows up, when we're feeling avoidance of our employees perhaps, or feeling hurt and disappointment. What kind of steps do we need to take to like work on the repair, right? And whether that's repair with ourselves and being kind and extending compassion here, whether it's extending compassion out. And then really, even if we feel okay with the situation that happened, how do we initiate repair? Maybe we're in a situation where we're not even the person who created the rupture or caused that. How do we invite in that repair, even in those cases, and actually engage in those conversations that are important?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to like write these things down, and I know we can listen to the episode again, but I'm like, okay,
and then
transparency.
We have like 3 other elements that we'd love to like be able to share about. Julianne, would you want to talk about seeking maybe next?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So seeking is really like the invitation to be curious and objective. And so we first conceptualize this, and you actually already hit on this. You first conceptualize this as like, what are the body cues that are telling you that you actually need to like slow down or pause, right? I think of all the emails I regret pressing send on, or all the assumptions that I really like jumped to, or started meetings off on the wrong foot unintentionally because I totally skipped so many steps and skipped the curiosity piece. And so how do we start to become aware of our cues within the context specifically of our leadership, right? And so, we're working with other therapists, and it's really easy for a therapist to be like, I know this. And we're like, yes. And what about in the context of when you're in leadership, right? When you're feeling stressed out because something didn't go according to plan, or when you presented something to your people and they weren't as receptive as you were hoping. How do you still stay in that like grounded energy and then get curious about like, well, maybe what are the gaps that I missed? How can I seek more information first and really gather everything? Because we have a tendency to want to like fix right away or like solve it without having everything. And then we unintentionally create other barriers or interrupt other processes because, again, we don't have all the information and we didn't move through it slowly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think having a therapist-client relationship is different than having a therapist-employee relationship. Or, maybe you're not a therapist and you're listening today. Maybe you are a boss of some kind or in some kind of management position or role, and you do have employees. And it is different than direct client care. Because I think there's maybe, I don't want to say more, but, you're in the break room with your team and things come up, or there is that financial piece at play too. I know, Poonam, you were talking about the retention and some of those more difficult conversations that you're not necessarily having. You're not having those with a client. You're talking about them in the room and their processes and their goals and how they can heal. So yeah, I think it is different. I mean, I do love this idea of transparency. One of my values as a human is authenticity and or transparency. And yeah, what does that actually look like in an appropriate professional environment? What do I do if someone doesn't like a policy? Like that invitation to collaborate and make sure that they understand the purpose of it. I know I've grown and I still have room to go most likely, but like really clearing the air before we leave a meeting of like, hey, was there anything else that you needed clarity on? If it's been like a pattern for me of like a staff member maybe leaving a meeting and not feeling heard or understood, really just checking in on like what they what they heard me say, or is there any story that you're telling yourself about this conversation that we need to correct in this moment? All of those things I just didn't have the skills for 6 years ago. And so yeah, it's definitely a learning process. And I'm sure if we did another podcast 6 years from now, we would talk about all the things that I've learned in the next 6 years. Yeah. Okay, so just to recap. So transparency is the first, the first of the trust. Clear, concise. Is that one in the same? Clear and concise policies.
So we skip the you. We talk about that at the end. We jump to seeking, which is the third. And then we have tact, which is all the things you're talking about already, right? Which is, it's about message delivery. It's anchoring people to purpose. It's being very intentional and human-centered in our communication, right? So what is it that we want our folks to experience? Whether this is us having a hard conversation, whether this is us rolling out a new change, right? Maybe there's something happening at a larger systemic level that creates change for us within our practice. So how are we talking about that change? And what's our intention in sharing that with our employees? And how do we acknowledge their experiences in doing this? How do we make this be set up in a way that they can hear it? And this might even be like, let's say we're doing a team building sort of an activity. What's our intention? How do we want them to experience this? What is the value we want to center? And how do we invite them into that space and conversation? How do they know what their roles are? Because how we say something, how we set up any of these meetings matters just as much, if not more than sometimes what we say. If we don't set this up well and maybe somebody checks out during a conversation, they're not going to receive the message anyway. So how we set it up is just as important, and how we deliver that is just as important as what we actually say. So that's one of the elements. And then our last one is unify, and I'm going to pass that on to Julianne to talk about.
So with unify, it's really bringing in like all the other 4 elements into the space, right? And so the hope is that we're modeling this for our employees, so then they're able to integrate these things too, because we know when groups have like the shared language and when we're able to understand what the agreements are, everyone's able to kind of show up in similar ways. So when you're modeling transparency, it invites them to also reciprocate, right? When you're modeling compassion and generosity towards them, it invites them to also reciprocate. Sometimes we need to verbally remind them and ask for it. And we always tell leaders, like, it's actually totally okay for you to say, like, I'm asking that you actually extend me generosity in this moment. And knowing that you yourself have also practiced and shown them that. And of course, we also want to name the power differential, right? And so it's important for the leader to name that part as well. And it's also okay to remind them that you're human, and to remind them that, yeah, I actually need grace at times too. I am actually going to make mistakes. And I hope I can model that for you and what it looks like when I take accountability to the mistakes I make, and also show you and model for you what it's like to move through this and to actually learn together, because we're all actually really learning through this in real time all together. No one holds all the answers. And so this is what like that collaborative piece looks like, right? And so how can we make sure that employee to employee, they're starting to then know how to have these conversations with each other? So rather than feeling frustrated at a peer, they're starting to feel empowered to actually share what they need with a peer because something continues to happen. Maybe it's in group supervision, maybe it's admin related, but they're feeling really confident to be able to extend grace, to say what they need to say, but also say it in a tactful way, also be able to extend curiosity. And so it's just like modeling these things, teaching them and practicing them for our people in hopes that they also are willing to like meet us. And then if they're not, being able to name that process as well. Like, I notice that generosity is not in the room, or I notice curiosity is not in the room. And I wonder what would that look like if we could restart this conversation and actually center those.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes to all of this. Yeah, it's just like we would do for a client, right? And, no matter what type of business you're in, if you are a leader, I'm sure that a lot of you listening, if not all of you listening, are hopefully extending kindness and generosity to your clients. And I think somehow, because we get tired, because we get busy, we get overwhelmed, we maybe miss that step. And I have personally found the value of naming, what is in the room, right? So we would do that with a client. And, if a client is not making eye contact, we might get curious, of course, around that in a loving, kind way. And I think it can be hard as leaders to have that same skill with employees. So that's something we certainly have to practice. And I know I've gone into some conversations like pretty anxious. And as we expose ourselves, we use a lot of exposure therapy in the practice, but as we expose ourselves to the hard thing, it actually gets easier over time. And so I think what's tricky, a lot of you, if you are not therapists, you maybe don't know this, but right, anxiety gets worse with avoidance. And there's a lot of research behind this. And so modeling, like you talked about, Julianne, like that assertiveness skill, that radical candor.
What's really interesting, Laura, is you said a couple times, like, we do this clinically, and we almost do this naturally clinically, and we forget to do it in our leadership. What's really interesting is a lot of those clinical skills do translate into leadership. We just don't necessarily know how to make them work in leadership.
Right. How to make it. Yeah. And I think that's probably a gift that you all give the people that you work with, right? Is like, what is the actual how to? Because if they are doing this as therapists, how are they also, maybe not doing it? And how can we learn and grow with employees? Yeah. And the tact, I love that you mentioned that, because I think that I've had to lean into this too. But it's just like with the client, like if our arms are crossed and we're like, tell me about your anxiety. I really want words about their anxiety. I mean, I know as someone who's done therapy for a long time, I wouldn't respond well to that. And so, yeah, it can be something that it's just hard and we have to be super mindful of it. It's almost like, I think sometimes as group practice owners, I know I have some friends who own group practices, like we almost give more grace to clients or show up more fully with clients. And so challenging us to do that with our team is just, I think, really important too. Yeah.
Well, and you're naming such an important process as far as what it's like to like philosophically want to show up in a certain way, but what does this actually look like in practice, which is actually what drove us to create our model, because we were like, okay, we're reading things that sound nice, but what does this actually look like when I'm in supervision and I'm finding that we're not making maybe movement on a goal we've talked about several times, and I'm feeling like really stuck on how do I support this employee and give them the support they need to then provide the best care to our clients, and like what does that process really look like? And so I think like that was our hope, is like how can we really talk about the practical things, and even like pulling from inspiration in the sense that when we're in a room of therapists and we're all talking through things through the lens of a certain modality, instantly everyone knows how we're conceptualizing things. Instantly we have shared language. Instantly we're able to like kind of unblock and get inspiration or clarity on what we'd like to do next. And so we're like, how do we do that with leadership? So when we're feeling really stuck or unclear, we can conceptualize and look through at something through a certain lens. And that helps us to find empowerment and like make sure we are being values aligned to like who we want to show up to be. And it can also practically just be like, oh yeah, I can do this like next thing. Like I don't have to be in this space of like, washing my dishes at night and arguing with my employee in my head kind of a thing, or waking up in the middle of the night really anxious that maybe I made a mistake or didn't show up in a certain way or whatever it is, right? We can be so hard on ourselves as leaders, and our employees are watching our whole process, which is, again, I know we spoke to that earlier, but it's just such a vulnerable thing. And all of our parts just really show up for us in a way that I feel like no other role really provides.
Yeah. And so if you all listening are therapists, we'll talk a lot about parts. So that language that Julianne's using, it actually comes from internal family systems. I'm sure that other therapy modalities, use this language, but it's essentially, we all have a healthy self and we all are capable, in my opinion, of leaning into that. But because life can be really hard and messy, we develop these parts, in air quotations, if you're watching on YouTube, we develop these parts of us that are trying to protect us, but maybe don't do a great job. They're trying to protect us a lot of times from feeling the hard things. So whether that's shame or fear or anger, or whatever it might be. And yeah, I agree with you that leadership can challenge our parts or challenge our old wounds that maybe we thought we had worked through, and somebody might remind us of somebody in our past, whether that's a friend or family member or perpetrator that like harmed us or hurt us extensively. And so I think that can also be rich work. If you aren't listening, is if you do have kind of, I don't want to say an issue, but maybe a concern is better language, a concern with someone on your team and they're your employee, it's like, hey, does that person remind you of someone? And is that part of the equation here? I know that's been really helpful for me. And what do I need? Right. So that's the question that y'all have just talked about so beautifully today. It's like, what do I need to move through this? Do I need to do my own work? Maybe is that an invitation for some unhealed trauma wounds there for me? But yeah, it can bring up a lot of our old wounds that maybe we didn't even know that were there. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you all so much for your time. I am curious, just as we close, so this trust model, I mean, we will certainly include in the show notes access to that and access to y'all on social media so that our listeners can find us if they are interested in working with you all or learning more about the work that you do. But do you have any last minute, I mean, I know you shared so many wonderful things, but any last minute kind of in closing, this is what we really encourage the leaders that we are working with to start with. I know we've talked a lot about introspection, curiosity, anything else that y'all would add to that?
I would add to create rituals around introspection specifically. So give yourself permission and grace to take the time to reflect on your day, your week, and really pay attention in that way. Make that like just as important as the supervision meeting, make that just as important as the client appointment, and make that time just as much of a ritual in your practice, in your leadership development.
Yeah. There's so much intention in that, I think. And I think it sends the message to you as an individual that like you are worthy of setting time aside for yourself, for your mental health, for your emotional well-being. Yeah, absolutely. Well, we always close the show with homework and an affirmation. So you all are welcome to provide one or both of those things. But based on what we talked about today, any homework that you would give our listeners?
I think two things that we like speaking to Poonam around rituals, I think two things that we would encourage viewers, whether you're in leadership or not, is to conceptualize where is a space where you can have either like a gratitude box, and also where is a space where you can have something like, let's say, a worry box. So where are you able to really like set things down and practice surrender and boundaries around the process in which you are maybe overthinking or doubting yourself, or in situations where you don't fully have control, right? Like leadership quickly lets us know how lack of control that we actually have. So where's a space where you can really do something around ritual? So we'll suggest like a worry box or whatever. That looks so different for everyone, right? That could be journaling, whatnot. And then also, where do you have the space to really celebrate yourself? Because often in leadership, what you're doing can be overlooked. Your employees don't fully understand the sacrifice, the intention, how much thought goes into this whole process. And so where can you have a space where you can print those emails that you get, or those cards you get, or you heard something where they shared something in supervision and you write it down to remind yourself. So on those really hard days and you're feeling really depleted and you're like, why am I doing this? You can like go to that and kind of remind yourself, or anchor yourself into the like, oh yeah, these are the things that really light me up. This is why I'm really choosing to have this kind of level of impact that's not just on our community, but it's also in the work culture that I'm creating and in the livelihoods that are here that we're supporting. So I would say, yeah, create some kind of space or box where you're practicing gratitude, and also where you can really surrender and let go of these other things.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, any affirmation?
Yeah, I would love to offer an affirmation. Let's see. What's coming to mind is, may you honor the wisdom of your being and stand in your self-worth.
Yeah. I'm going to take that with me today. Thank you. Yeah. Well, thank y'all so much for being on the show today. It's really been a true honor and privilege. And I'm going to run in Lauren's office and tell her all the things that I've heard from you all today. So yeah, I know that she would love to meet with you all at some point and meet y'all and hear from you and learn from you. So thank you for your time today. But I would love to hear a little bit more about how our listeners can find you.
I was waiting for Julianne to talk, so I'm going to jump in, edit that out. So on social media, on Instagram, we're at Level Up Leaders. And then we have our website, which is www.levelupleaders.org. And our trust model is actually on the website. There's also a link to an archetype assessment. So for group practice owners who are interested or curious about learning about their leadership archetype, that's a great start into that introspection process.
Awesome. I love it. Well, thank you both so much for your time. And thank you to our listeners for being here. We will see you next time on the Anchored podcast. Take care.